Shannon reads those books. The Oops! I've read it edition. Hey everyone, it's Shannon. And with my recent announcement of embarking on the reading adventure of reading those books, yes, those books, classic, iconic, Zeitgeist, those books that everyone's read, or they think they've read, or they want to read, or they pretend they've read, or maybe they actually have read. I'm gonna take on the challenge of reading them and seeing how that goes. And it's a list of over 400 titles. But the thing is, once I was looking at them and working with the list, I've actually realized I've read a bunch of them. Now, I've had reading droughts and floods over the years, but through that I've read about 10% of these books, and that's a pretty good stat. But to start things off before talking about the new ones I've read, I thought, why don't I talk about the ones I've already read? So here we go. This is going to be chronological from when I read them, from, just being a wee little mite to last year. So let's get this started. The first book I've read on the list is actually the first book I've ever read, which is Charlotte's Web. And when I say first book I read, I mean a novel with chapters. I'm pretty sure this had pictures in it, but it wasn't a picture book. It was a novel. And I really felt like a big kid, after reading it, and that was really exciting. I still enjoy the story, and I still have my copies somewhere in storage with all my other books. The next one that I read when I was a kid was Little Women. Did not like it. Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe did not like. I threw it against the wall and felt very tricked by it. But I did come to enjoy the series mostly through the films when reading and watching as an adult, feeling a little more distanced. So, you can change. Your opinion can change on things. Your experience can change over time. And then moving right along, when I was a teen, I read V.C. Andrews' Flowers in the Attic. I mean, I've been younger than a teen, but it was in that sort of era. Totally inappropriate, but, everyone was reading it, so I read it. I also read Stephen King's It, which is one of the only horror novels I've ever read, and one of the largest novels I've ever read at 1,089 pages. Why I remember that, I don't know. Maybe because I blocked out the horror. It's so scary. It's such a scary book. Anyway, and then moving on to high school, I was actually really surprised. For high school, I only read 3 titles that are on this list. I thought it would have been way more than that. In fact, during high school, books I read on my own is also 3 titles, so that's kind of shocking. But the ones I read for school include the 2 Shakespeare's that are on the list, which are Romeo and Juliet, which I enjoy, and Hamlet, which I'm not a fan of, although it does hold my favorite quote. So, hey, what can you do? I really wish Macbeth was on this list. I might have to make a list of books that should be on this list, or an accompanying list or something like that, but we'll leave that for another day and stick with the ones that I've read, because that's what this video is about. Last up for high school reading, I read To Kill a Mockingbird, which is exactly what I feel like this list is about. That is a book that I think everyone should read. It's an excellent story and great writing, really important, relevant, wonderful book. So there you go. And then the books I read in high school on my own include Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card, which is one of my favorite books of all time, definitely in my top 5. I also read Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. Love it. Love the movie, the 60s movie so much. And Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale. And it's so funny because Handmaid's Tale is like the one Canadian title that's on all these lists. And it's just kind of funny that it ends up being a dystopic novel. It's so not iconically Canadian, but maybe it is in its own way, like in a weird way. But so that's really weird. It's one of the reasons why I added a whole list of Canadian titles, is that I felt like they really needed to be represented. So bam, there they are. And then after high school, I didn't read as much. Oddly, I realized after years of it, part of it was I didn't have good lighting. But also, I went to art school and I studied fashion, so there wasn't a lot of reading fiction during that time period. I did get a few in, including The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Bridget Jones's Diary, and I, Robot, which I adore. The first story in I, Robot is genius, and it still makes me feel anytime I think about it. So it's really, really special. And then we get into the Harry Potter time period. And I love Harry Potter. I loved it when I came into it through the movies. I watched the first movie. And then I don't think I read the book first, but it went through I think it went through my mom and my sister Jamie and then me, or it might have been Jamie and then my mom and then me. And then it just was like everyone was, and then we were just all reading them. So I love them, and I really tried to only read the one where, like, I read Chamber of Secrets before Chamber of Secrets came out. I tried to do that cycle, but it became impossible because once Deathly Hallows was out, like, everyone avoiding spoilers on it was impossible. Like, heck, Canada Post was open and delivering on Saturday just for Harry Potter. So that is how widespread Harry Potter was. So anyway, I ended up just reading ahead and sadly came across some spoilers before that. But hey, I still love Harry Potter. I reread them throughout the time that the films came out, and I think that sort of began one of my book to film, experience journey, leanings is probably Harry Potter. But before and around that, I wasn't reading tons, but I did try and get back into reading, and I did try reading Lord of the Rings when the films came out. I was not very successful. I got about halfway through, and then I got to them in the late 2000s. I don't retain from Lord of the Rings. I just don't retain it very well. Don't understand it. At that time, I also read The Divine Secrets of the Yaya Sisterhood, which I was actually a little surprised to see on this list, although it is a good book and I did enjoy the movie. It's very, I don't know. And also Artemis Fowl, which I quite enjoyed, and I'm a little surprised I didn't continue the series, but at the time I wasn't reading that much overall. And then I slowly a few years later, started getting back into reading a little bit. And I read Memoirs of a Geisha, which is fabulous. Hard, but just wonderful. Oh, just an extraordinary book. And also The Picture of Dorian Gray, which I found to be an extremely challenging read just to understand what was going on in terms of the language and then to understand what was actually going on. I would have to reread passages and stuff like that, but I was very proud that I got through it. And then although this book is not on any of these lists, which is actually surprising in a Zeitgeist thing, but I can't leave out the fact that in 2008, the movie Twilight came out. And be a fan of it or not be a fan of it, you have to acknowledge the impact it had on people in reading. Just like Harry Potter did, Twilight really impacted people in reading. And personally, it was when I came back to reading with full force, for sure. I read Twilight and New Moon before Twilight, and I was hooked. Since then, I've read tons of books. I had one slow year, but, since then, reading has really taken off. So anyway, then we have 2008, and then my reading went up, like, insane. And there are two books that are huge now in terms of the films, but weren't even a whisper of films at the time, and that's I read The Hunger Games, which I loved, and The Road by Cormac McCarthy, which was a fascinating read, a really challenging read, unconventional narrative style, just wild. Can't widely recommend it just because it's so harsh, but wow, really enjoyed reading it. And then I started really actively reading stuff with the standpoint of things that are book to film, and that included my successful attempt at Lord of the Rings. I got through it. I don't know how much I retained, but I got through it. I also read Watchmen, the graphic novel for the film, which I don't know, it's not really my thing. And also Wuthering Heights, which I would say that I pretty much, my stance on that is that I hated it. Although, now taking a bit of a step back, I realize that so much of my over it is that I'm mad I didn't understand it. Like that, I read it, I'm an adult, I feel like my reading comprehension is pretty good, and I couldn't figure out what the heck was going on in that book at all. I will stand by the fact that I'm not a huge fan of the characters or the story, but I will step back from the grrness of that because that's more about my experience as reading it than it as a book. But although I still find it really hard to understand where like if it's sequential, not sequential, time and place, who's going on, who's talking, who am I hearing, who am I reading, what's going on. Anyway, but I'll put that aside. And then I actually started a book to film club, and I had to let it go after a year and a half because of life changing. But I read a lot of books for the book to film club that I really enjoyed and are of this ilk, which is kind of cool now that I look back on it. It's kind of like I was prepping for this this reading experience, and those books include Jane Eyre, which I adore, The Bell Jar, which I quite enjoyed, On the Road, which I hated. I am so sorry for any book to film clubbers that read it on my recommendation or suggestion. I did not get anything from reading that book other than a couple conversations with some guy friends, but honestly, I didn't really need to read that. And then also The Help, which was really, really good book, and I like the film as well. I also read The Hobbit, which I didn't quite again retain Tolkien. I just don't retain or understand what he's talking about. But I did love the first movie, and I also adored the book The Great Gatsby. Absolutely adored it. Although I feel like my experience of reading it and what I took from it and the characters I felt like I was following do not feel representative of the things I hear and see about the movies that of the book. So I still have to watch the film. I'm really looking forward to seeing the Baz Luhrmann one, but it's not what I felt like I was reading, which is one of the weird things when you read stuff not in school or not following any kind of, discussion or anything. It's just sort of like in your own world. At least that's how I found it. And then last year I did end up reading just by chance a couple of books that happened to be on this list, including the Lois Lowry's The Giver, which I absolutely adored. Great dystopic novel, and it's just a wee little slip of a book, and highly recommend it, widely recommend it. I got so much from it. Definitely a new favorite from me. And then I also attempted to read, because I like to challenge myself, I attempted to read Beowulf. Oh my god, I don't really understand what happened in it, like, at all, and I think it might be better to have read it in tree book format. I read it on my Kobo, and did not retain a lot from it, but I'll give it another go in a couple years and see how that goes. But I did read it. I mark that sucker as read, even though I don't understand it at all. I do have a couple oddities on the list, and the first of which is there's one audiobook, one of the books that I've read via audiobook, and that was Animal Farm. I'm not a big audiobook person. This is the only one I've read I'll listen to nonfiction. I have especially if it's spoken by the author, like, of course, love that, especially if it's an actor. But I don't like audiobooks because I feel like, especially this one, Animal Farm was probably a horrible choice because, like, the voices were, like, in, like, the voices of, like, pigs, and, like, it just, it doesn't work for me. And there is, it's a voice actor, so they're creating characters, and one of the things I like about books is that you fill in the world and the space, and I felt in an audiobook that it wasn't working that way for me. Now, I didn't love the story well enough to go back and read it, so I kind of consider this that I haven't read it because I didn't read it. I listened to it, and that feels different to me, but if I had really enjoyed it or wanted to explore it more, I'd go back and read it, but to be honest, I don't really. So I'm marking it as read, although I don't actually consider that I've read it, so that's an oddity. I also have a couple partials, books I didn't get through. Margaret Atwood's The Diviners. I read that. I started it in high school, and it was just, I think I was just a little too young for really to retain it. The Mists of Avalon, which if you see my recent pickup videos, I'll talk more about The Mists of Avalon. And then His Dark Materials. I've read 1.5 of the 3 books in that trilogy. So I was originally going to start with those, and then I'm like, well, I stopped reading those books, so maybe that's not a good place to start. So maybe I'll start somewhere else. It's also kind of funny to look back on this list and to see there's definitely a book to film, especially in the later years, current years. There's definitely a book to film trajectory. But when I look back on these, every single one of these titles has either had or has in development a film adaptation. So definitely that's where I lean. But a lot of the books on the those books list are to have adaptations, which is exciting because then you can see the story told in a different way. And especially for clarification purposes, it was really afterwards seeing a film version of Wuthering Heights was very helpful. So, but looking on the whole, like honestly, I also skew very science fiction and fantasy related. Although, and I've read 10 of them are fantasy, only 3 are sci-fi. But I've read 6 of the titles are either dystopic, like dystopic, or post-apocalyptic, which is huge. Like that's almost all of the dystopic titles on this list. I had no idea I was like such a dystopic, and this isn't even like just the current trend of dystopic, but stuff that I've read years and years and years ago. So that is really funny. I read 5 classics, 3 chick lit, 2 manlit, and then I put 2 new classics, 2 Shakespeare's, 1 horror, and 1 epic poem. So it's kind of all over the place, but definitely skews in the fantasy, sci-fi, dystopic, apparently, direction in terms of what I lean to. And then, but I want to expand my horizons is one of the reasons why I'm doing this overall, and to enjoy books, because that's what it's all about, to enjoy what you're reading. I love challenging, but I don't want to not like what I'm reading and not enjoy the experience. It's about enjoying the experience and opening up to new books, worlds, and ideas. At least that's what it is for me. So I hope you enjoyed this. Feel free to check the links below for the introduction video, and I'll also leave a link to GoodReads, which has the 400 plus titles on it. It's a little more than 404 just because several of the titles are actually series. Like a series is like one, like just trust me, I've done the math. It's fine. I've done the math. So anyway, there we go. Those books. 40 down, 37 down, 361 to go. Thanks for watching.